I'm Glauber Assis. I have a PhD in sociology. I'm also a psychedelic dad and co-founder of the Psychedelic Parenthood community, PPC. And today I'm here with my friend Emily Sinclair. She has a PhD in anthropology. She's also a psychedelic mom and education program coordinator at PPC. We are officially launching the Psychedelic Parenthood community, which is the very first international network of psychedelic parents and caregivers united across several continents with the purpose of bringing together parents from diverse backgrounds and cultures in psychedelic medicine spaces to connect, share knowledge and experiences, communicate, and support each other. And today we have the pleasure of being also fiscally sponsored by MAPS. So if you want to support our project, you can go to the MAPS page or visit our website, psychedelicparenthood.org. And for this launch, we have the great honor of welcoming a person who is a great inspiration to us who are psychedelic parents. He is at the forefront of many important battles and causes in the psychedelic field, including also psychedelic parenthood. And his activism also inspired very much our vision for the psychedelic parenthood community. He's the founder of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. He received his doctorate in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he wrote his dissertation on the regulation of the medical uses of psychedelics and marijuana. And his master's thesis is on a survey of oncologists about smoked marijuana versus the oral THC pill in nausea control for cancer patients. His undergraduate thesis at New College of Florida was a 25-year follow-up to the classic Good Friday experiment, which evaluated the potential of psychedelic drugs to catalyze religious experiences. He also conducted a 34-year follow-up study to Timothy Leary's Concord Prison Experiment and also studied with Dr. Stanislav Grof and was among the first to be certified as a holotropic breathwork practitioner. His professional goal is to help develop legal context for the beneficial uses of psychedelics and marijuana, primarily as prescription medicines, but also for personal growth for otherwise healthy people, and eventually to become a legally licensed psychedelic therapist. So, welcome, Rick Doblin. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for reading my entire bio there. The part you missed is that I have another sentence about I have living here in Boston with three empty rooms from children that have gone off to in their 20s, and gone off to college and live on their own. So I'm
Yeah,
also
that's
a
amazing.
self-selected.
Thank you very much. Actually, this was part of the very first question we
Oh,
have. So we all know you and your activism and your beautiful and important work in the psychedelic field, but we still don't know your background as a father. So can you
oh.
tell us a little bit about your journey as a father and also a psychedelic dad?
Yes, I'd love to. So first off, I think we need to say that I'm a late bloomer. I mature slowly. So, and it's been difficult to try to, sort out what I want to do in my life. So I didn't get married for the very first and only time until I was 1 month short of 40. And our first child was not born until after I was 41. And then we had three children in 4 years. So I'm sort of late coming to parenthood compared to a lot of people, but it felt like the right time for me. And I would not have wanted to do it any sooner. Now, one of the things that was clear is that because my work is so much involved with psychedelics and marijuana, that I would um, want to explain it to my children, what I was doing about psychedelics. And also because there's so much propaganda, negative information that you get in schools. My kids went through the DARE program, which is drug abuse resistance education run by police, completely biased. So I felt that I had to educate them early before they would start getting all these negative messages from society. But
Mhm.
what I also found when they were very little and reading them bedtime stories with my wife, that children want to hear the same story over and over and over. They really like it. And so for the parent, it gets kind of repetitive and boring.
Mhm.
So what I would tend to do then is I would smoke marijuana before I would read bedtime stories. And so I felt that marijuana and parenthood went together great. And my kids, when they were little, we didn't even tell them at the time that marijuana was illegal. Later, it became legal in Massachusetts for both medical and recreational. So they just took it as a normal thing. And one of the other parts is I'm Jewish, and we would read the Jewish prayers on Friday night. And one of the prayers is a prayer over the wine.
Mm.
So it's praising God for creating the fruit of the vine. And I would
Mhm.
add the fruit of the vine and the bud of the plant. And it was pretty hilarious that our youngest child, after growing up in this way, when she went to college, she went home for a friend of hers visit, and they were on Friday night, and they were Jewish, and they said these prayers, and they ended up with blessed our Lord, Lord of the universe, who's created the fruit of the vine. They all stopped. She went on to say, and the bud of the plant. And they all looked at her like, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I thought that's part of the prayer." She thought that that part was in the actual prayer book. So it was really hilarious for her to be looking at her friends' parents and others, and to be blessing the marijuana, and for them to say that's not in the official Jewish prayer book. We just added that. So from a very early age, they really understood, just that they associated marijuana with bedtime stories.
Mhm.
But they thought nothing of it. As they got a little bit older, we started saying, well, it's kind of at the time it's illegal outside of the house, and we have different views inside and outside, and then as they were growing up, that we talked to them all the time about, or not all the time, but a lot of time about what my work was and why psychedelics were important and why we were trying to study them in therapy and all these different kind of bits of education. So I thought that was really, really important. But one of the things that I remember very much about my childhood is that I was a bar mitzvah at age 13. I'm the oldest of four kids. And I had this idea that this rite of passage that has been used for thousands of years was somehow going to change me, that I was going to grow, that there would be some spiritual elements to it in my inner life. A lot of times you spend time in Hebrew school learning Hebrew and learning to read from the Torah and learning, about that. But I thought that this was going to be some kind of transformation and that there would be some kind of message from God or something. Just you're a child and you're thinking. And I had no older siblings to tell me that it was different for them. So I just remember this incredible emptiness waking up the next morning after my bar mitzvah was over and realizing that nothing had shifted internally. There was no connection with spirituality. There was no questioning, who am I? Where do I fit in? You know, am I more of a man now after my bar mitzvah? None of that happened. And so, again, I'm 13. And so I told myself, this takes time. God is busy. A lot of people got bar mitzvah. Maybe tomorrow something will happen. And then tomorrow, the next day, nothing happened. And then nothing happened again. And then now it's a whole week later, and it's the next Saturday, um, where bar mitzvahs take place, and all these new people got bar mitzvahed. And then nothing. I just realized that if God had a list, I had fallen off the list because there was so many new people that were going to be at the top of the list. And so it was just this emptiness. And so when I finally tried LSD 4 years later, when I was 17, almost 18, um, I thought this is questioning, who am I? Where do I belong? What is beyond myself? The sense of the ego dissolution a little bit. I'm connected to something much bigger. And I thought this is what my bar mitzvah should have been, this rite of passage, where now it's, do I have the courage to let go, to go into the unknown? It just made me realize that when kids are 12 and 13, in that age, and they're going through puberty. That's where traditional cultures have rites of passage.
Yeah.
And we didn't have that. So my wife and I thought about this a bunch. And when our kids turned 13, each of them, we said to them, we think you're ready for marijuana or MDMA if you want to do it. Just come to us and we would be glad to give it to you and we can do it together and you can see what these things do. And we think that it might really be helpful for you. And,
Mhm.
to our surprise, each one of these kids said, we're not ready.
Wow.
They didn't grow up in a psychedelic culture. I mean, they did in a way, but the larger society wasn't that.
Yeah.
And so they felt that they weren't ready. But it turned out to be the best anti-drug strategy we could have thought of is just give them, the
Yeah.
opportunity to do it. Then it
Mhm.
wasn't a sign of rebellion. It wasn't something that their parents, that they would sneak around and do. But over time, they did become interested, and we did provide access, and it was, my daughter when she was 14 wanted to smoke with us for the first time. My son, who's the oldest, and it was the most beautiful experience to bring that into the family setting. She's only 18 months younger than her brother, and there was a lot of um, rivalry as they were growing up. When it came time for her to try marijuana for the first time, he came along with us. And he was like giving her advice. So this is how you roll a joint. This is a bong. This I used the volcano vaporizer with her,
Uh-huh.
which you can see the smoke, it cools it down. It was kind of a gentle way for her to do it. And Eden, our son, and Lila, the daughter, they just were together for hours. And when he went downstairs after they'd gotten all this experience, she said to me that that was the longest that they had spoken in years in
Wow.
one period of time, that he was now the big brother and sharing things that she didn't know, and he felt more comfortable. So it really, the psychedelic parenthood brought our kids together.
Yeah.
And so, then on the 16th, when my son was 16, he and three of his friends were traveling through Europe for the summer, and I was doing psychedelic harm reduction at Boom Festival in Portugal.
Mhm.
And they ended up their trip after staying with a bunch of friends of mine and others, throughout Europe, four of these boys, and we knew all their moms, and their moms were speaking to my wife and saying, do you think these kids are going to go do psychedelics or something when they end up at Boom Festival? And she's like, well, she said, Rick is not so good at prevention, but he's very good at rescue. And so, as it turned out, they did want to do MDMA at Boom Festival, and I had this kind of secret hope, that they would do MDMA and my son would say, Dad, I love you. This is what's going on in my internal life. And here's how I am. And what happened is when they got the MDMA, the four of them, they immediately took off and we didn't see them for 24 hours. And I was, oh, this was like, because there's, 40,000, 50,000 people. It's a great thing to explore. They're wandering around. But finally he comes back. And I think, okay, now he's going to tell me how much he loves me and how much, here's what his internal life is. None of that happened. But what he said was beautiful. He said, Dad, now I understand why you want to make this into a medicine.
Wow. Hmm.
It was really
Beautiful.
touching,
Hmm.
and so each of my kids have done psychedelics with themselves, with their friends. They experiment with microdosing. I think they all have a pretty healthy relationship with
Hmm.
psychedelics. And I felt that it brought us together, and that in a way, this idea of being honest with your kids and sharing with them, it happens in ayahuasca communities, it happens in the Native American church. But in America, there's just this incredible divide between parents often scared to talk to their children for
Yeah.
fear of being exposed. And um, so I think that the drug war has got in between parents educating their children the way they want to. And that's one of
Hmm.
the worst parts of the drug war when it comes into your home and impacts how you speak to your children. And and this is the last thing I'll say of this section, is that a lot of people are not aware that in America, 23 states in the United States, there's a nationwide prohibition against use of alcohol by minors. And,
Wow.
by minors, we mean under 21. But 23 states have a parental override. Means that if you can give alcohol to your children if you want to, and
Mm,
it's not against the law.
mhm.
Now, that's not all the states, but around half the states where you can do that. And I think that's the way I think that regulation should be for psychedelics in the future, to be very clear that we want the families to be able to educate their children however they see fit. And whether it's to tell them never to do this, or to be honest with them, or to share it with them, or to not share it with them, that should be something that's in the parents, not the government. And that's, I think, the core place that we come at this, that I believe now, is that the education of children should be left to the parents. The government should not be interfering. And it's not, when we look at the way in which different societies have integrated psychedelics, the Native American church, as I said, they don't have age limits. So
Yeah.
I think that we've got the whole wrong system
Mhm.
in the United States right now.
I think, can I just, one thing I think that comes out so much from that is how what you're saying there and your example showing is if we if we're open with children and we actually introduce them even to psychedelics, then they're less likely to end up abusing these substances or others, right? Um,
I
you
think
know,
so.
so
And yeah, and they're also less likely to just rely on information from their friends. They're
yeah.
more likely to get information from their parents, which is often more reliable.
Yeah, and it creates this trust. I think often parents also are carrying a kind of a sense of a conflict, a guilt around what they do and what what they've been told and taught by society and their own family is right. And therefore, even if it feels good to them, they don't kind of speak honestly about it, their own use of psychedelics with their children, because it's ingrained in them that what they're doing is wrong. So yeah, one of the
Yeah,
things is lifting that taboo, isn't it?
it is. And even if they found it beneficial for themselves, somehow they think, oh, I have to, tell kids that this is dangerous. And
Mhm.
there's this understanding that drug education that you get in schools, this DARE program and others, when they exaggerate the dangers, then kids learn it's not true. And then they don't know who to trust.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
that's where we end up. We've got this society-wide. Now, there's another argument I'll just mention that is often used to justify sort of either lying to kids or trying to block them from using psychedelics. And that's this argument often put together by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, that children's brains are still developing, and they're
Mm,
still developing until they're 25. And that's why we need to prevent them from having any kind of exposure to drugs, because their brains are developing.
mhm.
Now, when it comes to layering in spirituality or love or connection, it seems the earlier you do that, the better.
Mhm.
I was at a Navajo peyote ceremony out on the Navajo reservation, and a Navajo man brought his 9-year-old son into the peyote ceremony. And this kid ate peyote. They let him lie down a bit where the rest of us weren't supposed to lie down, but
Mhm.
he spent the whole night. And
Yeah.
it's just beautiful to see that some kids are called for it, some kids are not. But this kind of absence of information from parents to children leaves them getting information either from society or from their friends.
Mhm.
And it's often misinformation. And
Mhm.
at the same time, when we have drug prohibition, what we end up having is very contaminated drugs. We have the people that are manufacturing the drugs are not about quality, they're about money, and
Mhm.
there's contaminated drugs. About a month ago, I was in Chicago for a foundation that was established to do psychedelic harm reduction, because 6 years ago, their son died from ecstasy contaminated with fentanyl. Leave children who might become interested in psychedelics to get stuff on the black market that they don't know what it is. It just compounds the dangers. It
Yeah.
doesn't make them safer, it makes them riskier.
I'm really glad you brought some reflections on rites of passage and also parental rights. I live in Brazil, and in Brazil we have a lot of problems in Brazil regarding drug policy, but something that is really interesting in Brazil is that we have a resolution regarding ayahuasca that is pretty much what you said about psychedelics. The parents, they have the right to serve psychedelics to their children in religious ayahuasca context. I am part of a psychedelic community in Brazil, and in my tradition, on the very first day of life, children they take a drop of ayahuasca. So my three children they take ayahuasca in symbolic doses, and they are healthy, they are happy children. And we know that also, as you mentioned, dozens of indigenous peoples they have been raising their children in contact, in relationship with plant medicine, actually for centuries. And
Yeah.
yet, many people say that we shouldn't even talk about the possibility of children and adolescents taking psychedelics, even though, as you already mentioned too, we know that thousands of children and adolescents today they're being also treated with drugs with far riskier side effects than psychedelics, as is, for example, the case with drugs such as Adderall, antidepressants.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
So
Yeah.
my question is, what do you think about these claims? To what extent is this a scientific perspective, and to what extent is it a social stigma associated with the war on drugs?
Well, I don't think it's scientific. So let me talk about a study that Charlie Grove did and others did. And this was after ayahuasca was legally available in Brazil. Dennis McKenna, Charlie Grove, and others, they did a study of adolescents in the União de Vegetal who had
Mhm.
experience with ayahuasca. And they did comparison study with people that were in the same socioeconomic status, but who were not part of ayahuasca churches. And they did a comparison between the mental health of the children. And they showed that those children who had experienced with ayahuasca were actually mentally more mature and healthier than those children who had not been exposed to
Mhm.
ayahuasca. So that's a scientific study that was done to try to help the Brazilian government be comfortable about these policies that you say that parents can permit it to be, they can make the decisions about whether their children should use it or not. I think that the scientific evidence looks at if children overdo things, like if children, let's say, smoke marijuana every day and go to school stoned, and they will not necessarily learn as much as others, so that there are a lot of these scientific studies supposedly about the evils of kids using drugs, about kids that use them too much.
Mhm.
So it's very the case that, yeah, you can use anything too much and it's not going to be helpful to you. But I don't think that there's anything in neuroscience that says that, oh, children while their brains are developing, because I think it's something that I was incredibly shy when I was growing up. I could talk to guys, but particularly when I was like 12, 13, I just was paralyzed in talking to girls. I just couldn't do it. I think a lot of guys are like that somehow. Um, and I think if I would have had MDMA when I was 13, I would have been more emotional. I would have been more able. I would have had a way better time in high school. would have, um, so that I think, but more importantly, I think when you layer in deeper connection to spirituality, deeper connection to your own emotions, that's incredibly healthy. And the sooner that we can do that, the better. And there's now a lot of discussions in America about what's called social and emotional learning. When you go to schools, what you're mostly learning is about your brain. There are some schools that do art, that do physical education, particularly when you're younger. You get, exercise, you get to express yourself in some ways in artistic creations, but it's mostly just you're educating your brain, your thinking, your rational parts of your mind. And there's an underdevelopment of emotions and spirituality. There's a incredible quote. E.O. Wilson is a brilliant scientist, taught at Harvard for a very long time, very much focused on ants. But what he said was that the problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, with medieval institutions with godlike technologies. So I would say that as a species, as individuals, we are way overdeveloped in our mind and way underdeveloped in our emotions and in our spiritual connections. So the sooner that we can help children learn how to be more emotional and process their emotions and feel their emotions. I hardly even knew I had emotions. I was just so locked up in my mind. I think that that makes a lot of sense. So I'm not aware of any real scientific evidence to suggest that you must protect people, from drugs as they're growing up. And then also, this is just a different thing. My son went to college in Canada. They have an 18-year-old drinking age instead of a 21-year-old drinking age. And he said that was just so much more sensible because all kids in America, they sneak alcohol. And when you do that, you um, look for more and more powerful amounts so you can take it more quickly. It's just
Yeah.
counterproductive. So I think we've got this situation where we get the worst of outcomes by our prohibitions against scaring um, parents from talking to their children. Here's another thing, just from alcohol. There was a meeting at our high school with the police to scare parents to say that if you provide a place at your home for your kids and their friends to do alcohol, instead of having them do out in the woods or whatever they're doing, you provide a safe place for them to do alcohol, you yourself could go to jail for that. If there's
Wow.
They scare parents from not even providing a safe place for their kids to do alcohol, and they push them into the riskier circumstances.
Yeah.
So I think we have a completely counterproductive system. And that's why I think, psychedelic parenthood is so critically important because the whole rest of society, in a way, is sort of pushing in the other direction.
Hmm.
And so it's really important, the work that you're doing to try to educate people. And I think it's also um, the key to helping us move to a post-prohibition world because the fears are we got to protect our kids from drugs. We have to lie to them also. We can't have information that they hear about how it might be useful. And it just ends up we get the opposite of what we wanted. So that's why I'm so open and glad to be speaking with you today.
There's so much to say from that, but one question I have, so related to everything you're saying about adolescence there. So do you envisage there being doing research with psychedelics and adolescence in future for MAPS? And another thing that came up from everything you said then is the importance of the context, right,
Yeah.
for that. So, how can we create research that really reflects a healthy context to be taking psychedelics? Is that something that we can do?
I think we can do that. I think we must do that. I think what people don't realize further is that now the research into MDMA for PTSD is being done by Lykos, the pharma company that we started. But
Mhm.
what Lykos has been told is that if FDA approves MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD, it will be for people 18 years or older. We think that
Mhm.
will happen. It didn't just happen now, but it should happen in a couple of years. But then Lykos is required to study adolescents with PTSD.
Ah,
Now,
okay.
these are not normal adolescents in the sense that they've got PTSD, but
Yeah.
Lykos is required to do that. And not only are they required, but they're incentivized to do that. So there's this period because MDMA is in the public domain. There's what's called data exclusivity, which is incentives for developing drugs that are off label. In the US, you get 5 years data exclusivity
Mhm.
if you're a pharma company that makes a drug into a medicine that's never been made into a medicine before, but that's in the public domain. But then if you do these pediatric studies, you get an additional 6 months of data exclusivity. So it's both a requirement and an incentive for doing these studies. Now, they are traumatized children. And I think the idea here is that the drugs are often by the FDA, they're approved for adults, but then pharma companies never study them in children. And so the pediatricians, the other psychiatrists don't know really about dosing. They don't have the information. So that's why the FDA is requiring not just us, but many, many more pharmaceutical companies to do adolescent studies as well. But adolescent doesn't mean where it ends. We need to go down to like 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds if they're traumatized eventually, because again, this idea that PTSD or depression changes your brain.
Yeah.
And so if we can help restore children's brains to normal functioning, there is going to be so much more um, healthy lifestyles that they have, and we'll avoid so many more mental health problems.
Mhm.
So I think there's no doubt that psychedelics will be used in children after they're approved for adults. And that I
Yeah.
think that's a really important requirement that's
Mhm.
happening. And
Um,
I also think that when we just have this idea that um, this openness to your own emotions, that there's a thing called ACEs, the ACE score, which is adverse childhood experiences. And so there's this clear understanding that the more adverse childhood experiences you have, the more likely you are to have mental health problems and addiction problems as an adult.
Yeah.
And so that just further suggests that we should treat people as close to the trauma as possible.
Hmm.
And even if they don't have the words. Now, let me switch here just for a moment to talk about the study of MDMA in octopuses. And you'll see how this relates to kids. So, Gul Dolan is a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins. She's now at UC Berkeley, and she is done a lot of animal studies with psychedelics. And
Wow.
so, if people have seen this documentary, My Octopus Teacher, it's really interesting, but it's about octopuses as solitary creatures. And they only
Mhm.
get together with other octopuses near the end of their life for mating season, and then they'll have babies and then they'll die. But the rest of the time, they fight other octopuses. They don't want to be with other octopuses. They're solitary creatures. But around 600 million years ago, humans and octopuses diverged in the evolutionary line, and octopuses still process serotonin. And so Gould was wondering what happens if you give MDMA, which does release serotonin, to an octopus. And we provided her, MAPS provided her with the MDMA. And what she learned, there's an experiment. There's an octopus in the center of this contraption. There's two doors. One goes to a room where there's another octopus in a bird cage where it can't get out. It just stays there. The other door goes to a ball or a toy, also in this cage where it can't move. So the octopus will spend way more time with the inanimate object than the other octopus. And when it's with the other octopus, it's only around the edges of that, and then it leaves. No matter how you switch the sexes up, it will still hang out more with the inanimate object, the toy, than with the other octopus. However, you soak the octopus in water that has MDMA in it for 10 minutes. It took them a while to figure out the right dose. And then they put this octopus back in this experimental chamber. And now they spend more time with the other octopus. And when they're with the other octopus, they're touching their tentacles and they're
Wow.
interacting. So what it means is that this pro-social aspects of MDMA is evolutionarily conserved and pre-verbal. So
Mhm.
when you have children that are not as eloquent about expressing their emotions or things,
Mhm.
they can, but if they've been traumatized, they will still be able to have um, these pro-social aspects of the experience. So
Yeah.
I think that psychedelic, now this is, I don't know exactly the story for ayahuasca or for peyote or for,
Mhm.
mushrooms, but I think that it's quite similar that these will have experiences that are interesting. The other thing is about ketamine, just to say, is that ketamine is used as a dissociative anesthetic. And many people will know now that in like 1/10 the psychedelic dose, ketamine is used 1/10 the anesthetic dose. Sorry, the psychedelic dose is like 1/10 the anesthetic dose, and it's used for depression right now. And a
Yeah.
lot of people are using ketamine for depression. But when it's used for operations, people are not prepared that when the dose wears off for the anesthesia, you pass through a psychedelic phase. And they call it the emergent phenomena. When you're emerging from anesthesia, you go through
Mhm.
this weird psychedelic phase. People not prepared for it might say it's weird. And adults have a lot more problems during this emergent phenomena than children do, particularly
Yeah.
younger children. They're more already living in their imagination. They're not, quite sure. So ketamine is used a lot as an anesthetic in children,
Yeah.
precisely because they can
Yeah, true.
handle it better.
Yeah.
I just think that our society has it all upside down, and
Mm.
that we need to really provide um, much more therapeutic access for
Mhm.
children. But also, again, it gets to this idea that parents should be able to educate their children as they want. And the study that Charlie Grove and others did with children from the Unyadovich Tal is evidence that if it's in the context. So if they sneak out and do it with their friends and they get these different experiences and they can't handle them and they suppress them, they can end up worse off. So it's not in the drug, it's in the context. And there will be families that are abusive and families that are not good or families that don't want to do this. But I think overall, it's much better to put it in the hands of families to educate their kids than have the government say, no, you cannot do that.
Definitely. And speaking of contacts and relationships, Rick, I remember that last time I saw you in New York, you mentioned that one of the concerns, and I've seen people talking about it, is that how could we offer a dissolution, an ego dissolution to people who don't have an ego yet? And I was thinking that this is just such a specific epistemological frame that actually misses the point and puts apart culture. So when I see my children in our community, for example, they are part of the culture. They're playing around, they're dancing, and I even sometimes I think that we could use also another concept, psychedelics, but also somadelics, because of this corporeality, this capacity of moving our bodies, of playing. And when I do research on children and adolescents or people who were raised in ayahuasca cultures, they usually they talk about how beautiful and bright their childhood was. So I wonder if you consider that bringing families to the conversation, cultures that are part of the that are psychedelic cultures, if this is at any point also related to the paradigm shift that you always talked about, like the importance of not only think about the drugs or the substances, but also the therapy and also the group, the community. How do you see these things all together?
Very much the way you're describing. So that Michael Pollan, who wrote the book How to Change Your Mind, he's recently been saying at a conference that I was at just last month, is saying that, oh yes, I'm against, I'm not, I don't fully understand, and don't think it's a good idea to help children lose, have a ego dissolution experience before they have an ego. Well, there's no evidence why he's saying that. That's just his thing. But also, you turn it all around upside down. If they're still forming their ego, they should have a greater connection with being in a non-ego state. So it should be easier for them than adults. It's not so scary to lose their ego. I think that's the story about kids and ketamine when they use
Yeah.
it for anesthetics. So I think it's just really an upside down theory. The cultural prejudice is what is making Michael Pollan say that.
Helps them stay connected to that state that
Yeah.
isn't the ego, right? Yeah.
Exactly. It's exactly the opposite. So I'll just tell this brief story. This was neighbors of mine. This is back when MDMA was still legal in the 80s. I think I mentioned this too, Glover, that um, this family wanted to do MDMA. The parents did it. They found a lot of benefit, but they wanted to do it with their family, and they had a 7-year-old daughter. And they said, we want to do it together. And so they wanted to know what my opinion was. And my opinion was, well, it's up to you, but I don't think it would hurt her. I don't buy into this brain damage neurotoxicity thing, but give her a half a dose, something like that, if you're going to do it. So they decided to go ahead and they did it. And I went and saw the family the next day. And I talked to this little girl. She was hanging upside down on the back of a couch. So I did the same thing. So the two of us are hanging upside down on the back of this couch. And I'm saying, what happened when you did this MDMA? She said, well, I had this feeling that I was up in heaven watching my mother before she got pregnant with me, getting ready to be a mother.
Wow.
And I said, did you really feel you were up in heaven? She said, I don't know, it just felt like that. And I got the feeling that she wasn't telling a story to get attention, that that's actually what she felt. And it brought the family together. Now, the other part is that when we talk about these global humanitarian projects, let's say there's an estimate that there could be over 1 billion climate refugees by 2050 if we don't change the the way the climate is getting worse in different ways. So when you think about that, I'm talking about Ukraine also. There's like 1 million Ukrainian refugees in Poland. There's tens of millions. There's so many people in the Middle East. So many families are traumatized together.
Mhm.
So I think that the treatment that makes sense to me is going to be to treat families together. If the families have been traumatized together, it makes sense to treat them together, parents and children. You
Yeah.
give different doses, but I think the parents can then be the main therapist in a way to comfort their children, and they can draw strength together. So when we think about trying to scale therapy for PTSD, particularly to refugees, migrants, all these families that are traumatized in all these different ways, I think it makes sense to treat them in families.
Mhm.
And that's something that I look forward to experimenting with over
Mhm.
time. That's never been done. There's no quote evidence about it, but it makes sense to me as something that will help the children feel even more safe because they're there with their parents.
Mhm.
And it will help them sort of share their grief about what happened, and they'll all understand each other more. So I think from this is now not spiritual use, but more therapeutic use. I think that the models that we're gonna be exploring in decades to come are more group therapy models and treating families together.
Mhm. And then there's shared integration as well, isn't there? And and as difficult things come up, there's that shared experience
Yeah, that's
after.
exactly right. And now we have, kids have created or young people, the raves. The raves are like another um, form of rite of passage
Yeah.
where people can feel together, but they've created them in general without a lot of, adult supervision.
Mhm.
But now that's changing because, there's been decades and decades of people have done psychedelics. But I think that the idea of rites of passage that are being recreated that involve psychedelics are to try to address this emptiness that the rites of passage don't work. And I think right about the integration process that when you have families that have experienced trauma together and then they've experienced a healing experience with psychedelics, they're going to be able to support each other much better.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the drug war is based on, oh, we got to protect the children. And that's why it's also so important is that there's a
Yeah,
better way to protect the children. And that's with honest information
Yeah.
and helping them have these experiences if their parents want them to.
def-
But it's so interesting that so my experience is in ayahuasca cultures in Peru. And so my daughter had ayahuasca when she was in the womb, and she joined me in ceremony in her first year of life. This was, I was taught by my maestros that it makes the baby stronger, and this, I saw how their children had ayahuasca from when they were young. And so it was completely normalized and healthy in that culture. And yet it's still shocking. I feel, whilst I support, everything you're saying about children in the West, how it would be, it would be good for us to do that similarly, in this family environment. It still shocks more, right? Because it's so deeply ingrained in me that we don't do that in the West. So the idea of us doing research and giving psychedelics to kids in this kind of open way is it still feels more shocking
Yeah.
than it doesn't at all in the Amazonian culture. So it just
Yeah.
shows how deeply ingrained those beliefs are, and what we get taught.
Very much. Just the way culture is so critical because when you talk about the psychedelic experiences, culture is helps people to interpret them and
Yeah,
helps people support them. So the culture is more the cultural context, the set and setting is more important than the drug experience itself.
yeah, yeah,
it's
And,
beautiful.
and that's where I think the work that you're doing with the psychedelic parenthood is really trying to change cultural attitudes.
yeah,
I
absolutely.
think that you've probably got a very challenging job to do that will take decades and decades to get a different kind of message across. But I think it's one of the key messages because The war on drugs, as I said, is, oh, we got to protect the children, but we really need to protect the children with honest information. And for those that are interested and curious, I think also that, just talking about the world in general, that we have too much of this, people fighting each other because of their religion or their country or their gender or their race. We need to see our humanity, our common humanity.
Mhm.
I think psychedelics are really good at helping people get beyond their ego sense and feel our connectivity. So I think part of what I think is going to be necessary is kind of a planetary consciousness shift
Yes.
from competition to cooperation. And I think psychedelics, in a cultural context that's supportive of that, can be very helpful.
Yes, definitely. And part of the reason we are starting this psychedelic parenthood community is also to give the parents and caregivers a community so they can also share their experiences. They can also raise their voices because we know that thousands of people who are part of the psychedelic field, their parents, their caregivers, and yet this can be a very lonely journey. In Brazil, we have this sad situations in which parents they lost the custody of children because they are part of psychedelic traditions and communities. And but actually, talking about my own experience, and I know that Emily also has a beautiful story to share. And I've been talking to many, many parents, and there is a similarity among these experiences across the whole world because actually, psychedelics they can support parents, they can be beneficial. Actually, psychedelics literally saved me as a parent also to deal with this parental guilt, this feeling that we are not enough. I don't know how I can make my children happy. And psychedelics really are helping me to be a better parent. So I would ask you about your thoughts on how psychedelics can also be beneficial for parents.
Well, I think that there's this aspect about psychedelics that really help people confront death and the cycles of life, that you're more aware of, I would say, that the enormous sweep of history, of which we're just awake at a really tiny part of it, but the vine of the soul. So I think there's much more of this confrontation with death in psychedelics. And I think as a parent, if you are able to really come to terms with death and accept it, and even potentially be grateful to death for making life meaningful, that if there were no death, we'd go on forever. There'd be no urgency to do anything. So I think that kind of understanding of death helps you realize that your children are going to, um, and you are only going to be around for a limited period of time, and that instead of sort of thinking that you can just take forever and you don't need to educate them, until and let society do this and stuff. I think that the psychedelics can make people appreciate the urgency of the now. This was a big, Martin Luther King had this statement, the fierce urgency of now. Parents can then see. And then I think another part of it is that a lot of times when you're going through psychedelics, you can have your own traumas from childhood come to the surface. Even if you had the most loving parent, you could be bullied at school. It has nothing to do with your parents, but or you could have an accident, or you could have a friend die in a car crash, or whatever. So I think as parents experiment with psychedelics, you see how impactful experiences that you have as a child, unless they're fully processed, can impact the rest of your life, often in a negative way. So I think that sort of, we call it the archaeology of trauma, that there's layers and layers of trauma that you uncover. And people who have had childhood trauma are more vulnerable to getting PTSD or depression or addiction or anything as an adult if they've not processed their trauma. So I think that adults going through psychedelics themselves as parents can really have this inner knowledge about how powerful we've been influenced by experiences in our childhood. And I think that will make us want to be more supportive of our children. And if they have difficult experiences, really try to help them navigate and experience them, and not sort of pretend it doesn't happen. And
Mm.
So yeah, I think there's so many different ways that psychedelics in a appropriate therapeutic, cultural, spiritual context can help make people better parents. Another last thing I guess we have meant to say, which is epigenetics of trauma.
Yes.
So what we know is that human evolution takes place over extraordinarily long periods of time. So your DNA is not really changing, but you can have a traumatic experience that impacts um, which genes are turned on and turned off. So
Mhm.
if you are traumatized, there are epigenetic mechanisms that can increase your sense of anxiety and fear, and you can pass on multi-generational trauma to your children
Mm.
that that they will get these same epigenetic mechanisms. So Rachel Yehuda is a researcher at the Bronx VA and at Mount Sinai University. She's done studies with Holocaust survivors and their children and have helped identify what she thinks is epigenetic markers. And the research that she's doing now is to try to look at these markers of epigenetics before and after treatment with MDMA assisted therapy. And preliminary evidence suggests that you can change these epigenetic markers so that you don't pass on multi generational trauma to your children.
Yeah.
Now, this is early, but I think that that's probably going to be explored a lot more in the future and may actually be proven. So I think that, and even if we don't talk about epigenetics, just if parents can heal their traumas, their anxieties, they're more likely to be better loving parents for their children.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I think there's just so much to talk about in terms of psychedelic parenthood that it's one of the hot buttons that people think. But I think Emily, just to say about the courage, I guess, that you had to take ayahuasca when you were pregnant, because there's so much of this kind of, oh, you're going to have birth defects, you're going to have all these problems, it's going to be really bad.
Yeah.
And the
I just
evidence,
knew that wasn't, I don't know, it's just a knowing, isn't it? And a trusting in
yeah,
my teachers there. Yeah. Yeah. And
yeah,
cognitively was always incredible, speech incredible. Yeah. Understanding. Yeah. No, clearly no problems there. No.
wow.
Yeah, that's beautiful because also if we take the social sciences evidence on the use of psychedelics by children, we have a very interesting study about a specific region of the Amazon rainforest, when we can see clearly that the children that are part of the ayahuasca traditions there, they have better results in school compared to the towns surrounding these communities, which is pretty interesting. And
Mhm.
oh, I would like to go through this conversation forever, but in honoring Rick's time, we I think we have space for two more questions. Do you want to go with another one, Emily, please?
Yeah, I guess the question I most want to ask is how do we make psychedelic conferences and spaces more open to families and children? Because this
Ah,
is, I'm a single mother and I've been to many conferences in the past, and last year I went to a couple, but I had to leave Ava behind, and I'd love to not have to do that. So
yeah.
that's my big
Well,
question.
that's a wonderful question because, we're planning for Psychedelic Science 2025, June
Hmm.
16th to the 20th in Denver. We had 12,400 people come to Psychedelic Science 2023. And we've already been having discussions about having childcare at the
Ooh.
conference.
Fantastic.
Yeah, now we've not finalized it, but that is one of the ways to do it is that you have trained educators, childcare people that are, in a couple of the conference rooms, that you devote to childcare.
Yeah.
So it should be, and I think it'd be pretty interesting for kids to be there. They can
Mhm.
interact with each other. So I think that's one of the main ways to do that is to really promote childcare at the conferences. Um,
Brilliant.
Other ways, it's depends on the age of the kids, but I don't know that we'll be able to do this in Colorado this time, but again, this idea of ceremonies where parents and children
Mhm.
can attend together, that
Yeah.
that would be something really special.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, I think it's really about childcare at the conference as a way to make that. Do you have any other suggestions how to do that?
Well, that was definitely the big idea is to have creches. Yeah. Creches at conferences, educational spaces for children who are a bit older, in
Yeah.
future, certainly.
Yeah.
And ceremonies, yeah, we have ideas. Those are the main ones. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and there
Yeah.
was how was it called, Rick? It was the outer space. I don't remember that
Oh,
place.
deep space. Deep
The deep
space.
space, yeah. So I was at the deep space the last conference. It was just amazing. I had such a great time. But I was thinking that wow, we could have like a playground so people could have fun.
Yes, yes,
Kind of
yes, yes.
conferences, you know.
Big mushrooms and things for kids to play on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it would be beautiful. It's such an amazing idea, Rick, and if you can definitely count on the PPC team to support in any way. This
Mhm.
is what we would love also to offer to support. And just a last question, because this as an initiative, because we've been doing this as parents forever, but being a community. But the psychedelic parenthood community is starting just right now as an official initiative, program, project. So, what do you feel is the most essential aspect of building a psychedelic parenthood community? Do you have any kind of suggestions, advice on how we can create this ecosystem of parents and caregivers in the psychedelic field?
Um, that's such a good question. I think it's having safe places for parents to talk about their concerns, both with the society and their own concerns about how to educate their own children.
Mm.
Because I think people feel pretty isolated if they want to be honest with their children. And so I think this idea of parent support groups, as
Yeah.
far as that I think would be really good. I think like Emily, to hear your experience of having done ayahuasca when you were pregnant. I mean,
Mhm.
more of those kind of stories
Yeah.
to help people feel, that they're not alone in wondering about whether to do that. I mean, there's
Mm.
um yeah, so I think that's probably just discussion groups where parents could come together and talk about their how they want to educate their children. And just to hear, because I think very few parents are probably even exposed to this idea
Yeah.
that it's somehow or other indigenous or certain cultures give psychedelics, let psychedelics um, have their children exposed to them if they want to at certain ages under parental supervision. I think most people don't even aware that those models exist.
Yeah.
So that I think would be great. And so if you can have some discussion groups at Psychedelic Science coming up, just for parents to come share their thoughts and concerns, that would be really helpful.
And
Amazing.
is there any question that we didn't ask you would like to answer, or anything you would like to add to this conversation?
I think mainly just the thing I had is just how this is such a critical conversation because the drug war is based a lot on protecting children, and it doesn't protect children. It makes them more vulnerable.
Mhm.
And so I think having more of these discussions is really very important.
Yes, and this brought me just a last question, if you allow us, like about the future, because you are a visionary and your courage actually to talk about this topic, because I've been seeing you addressing this topic in conferences and in conversations with people. So, what's your vision about the future for psychedelic parents and families?
Well, I like this idea of rites of passage, for adolescents at 12 and 13. So I think that, it's one thing to say to our own children, when you're 13, if you want MDMA or marijuana, we'll give it to you. But to have communities come together to create rituals for their children in a Western context, because those do exist in ayahuasca and peyote and communities, but we don't really have them in those people that are more um, westernized and more in kind of cult in America, stuff like that. I think that this the kind of community support. So for example, the prom, the high school prom, where you're 16 and but then everybody's told you can't drink alcohol, you can't kids are searched before they go to the prom, all this kind of stuff. Parents are so I think to do that around and say, look, maybe parents could say, here's I give permission for my children to be part of this a ritual, but supervised by parents, that some parents are there, but that helps them have this rite of passage or this ceremonial experience. I think that's the future, is going to be more of community support in um, cultures that have not necessarily got a religious experience that's centered around a psychedelic like ayahuasca or peyote or stuff. So I think that'll be a big part, and that'll be interesting to develop these rituals too, because they'll all be different cultures, different kind of rituals, and so I think the future is bright as far as psychedelic parenthood.
Wow, great. Yes. So, thank you, Emily, and thank you, Leah. And I want to just give this big, big, big thanks to MAPS for fiscally sponsoring the Psychedelic Parenthood community. And a big thanks to you, Rick, for paving the way and for, yeah, being at the forefront of this very, very, very important discussion on psychedelic parenthood. Thank you very much for being with us today.
My pleasure, totally.